Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining this keynote from SpaceGen United. This is day 4 of SpaceGen United, and it is the final keynote of the day. My name is Clément, and I'll be moderating this keynote for the coming hour. So just so you know, it's going to be a 30 minutes presentation from our guest, and then followed by 30 minutes of questions. So don't hesitate to ask all your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom for the delegates, or in the comments section of the YouTube live video. And with that, I'll just introduce our speaker. It is my pleasure to welcome here today Peter Martinez. Peter Martinez is the Executive Director of the Secure World Foundation, and he has extensive experience in space diplomacy and space policy, as well as space regulation. And he's going to be talking for the next hour. So with that, I'll leave the floor to you, Peter. Thank you. And we'll see you for the Q&A section.
Thank you. Thank you, Clément. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's always a great pleasure to present at SGST events. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference. It's a great pleasure for me, and also on behalf of Secure World. We really enjoy our relationship with SGAC. So Clément, I don't think I'll speak for an hour. I'll leave some time for your delegates to ask questions. Maybe I'm going to aim for about 35 minutes or so. We'll see. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen, and then we'll go into the presentation. So if you can just confirm that you're seeing my slides correctly now.
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah, okay, terrific. So what I want to talk to you about today is the whole idea of space and sustainability, and the connection between sustainable development on Earth and our sustainable use and exploration of outer space, and to mention some of the challenges that we encounter in this regard. And then I want to tell you a bit about Secure World Foundation, which is the organization that I'm representing here today. I'll tell you a bit about the work that we do and some of our programs, which I am sure will be of interest to many SGAC members. I just want to begin with this iconic image of planet Earth. This was one of the photographs that was taken by one of the Apollo astronauts on the way to the moon in 1972. And it shows the African continent. It's become a really iconic image of the space age. And ironically, it also showed the continent that over the years has had the least kind of presence in terms of space activities carried out by people from the continent, although happily that situation is changing, and perhaps we can talk a bit about that later on in this session. But really, when one hears about space exploration, most people, especially those who are not connected with the space sector, this is the kind of thing that comes to mind. Things like human space exploration, robotic exploration of planets. Many people are aware of the International Space Station or the Space Shuttle, you know, human space exploration in general. And indeed, many are quite aware of the benefits that space exploration has provided to humanity. And of course, we have become used to seeing amazing images of the Earth from space, and also of other planets. Satellites have given us amazing views of not only the universe in which we live, but the other planets in our solar system, moons, comets, etc. But of course, the planet that matters most to us is the one that we actually live on. And I've just chosen, this is an image of Dubai. I'm sure most of you will recognize it. And really, most of the systems that we put into space are put there to provide services to people on the ground. And really, the vast majority of satellites are there serving people on the ground. And most of us rely on these space-derived benefits, information and services in ways that many people don't realize. And that indeed, if we were to switch off all these space systems, daily life would become very inconvenient and in some cases even hazardous. So I mentioned that all of these satellites that have gone into space, a vast majority of them are there to provide services to people on the ground. And so therefore, what this means is that during the last 60 years or so of the space age, we've seen a great increase in the number of satellites, beginning with the launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957. But as we go through the decades, you see that the number of objects in space has increased dramatically, which you see in this sequence of images showing the number of space objects larger than about 10 centimeters, which is kind of what we can track with current capabilities. And you see the number increasing steadily over the decades. So this increase in space objects has both brought benefits as well as concerns in terms of the congestion of the orbital environment. I should emphasize, of course, that these individual dots are certainly not to scale. They're just showing the individual objects that are larger than 10 centimeters. But you can see here on the left-hand side, the clustering in low Earth orbit, and particularly you can see the sun synchronous orbits, which are very heavily occupied. And then on the right-hand side of these images, you see the geostationary arc and indeed many of the other inclined orbits or medium orbits, which are where, for example, the navigation constellations reside. So I started the talk by referring to the benefits of space technology. And I'm sure that most, if not everyone attending this presentation this morning has heard of the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, which was adopted by the United Nations in 2015. And these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, about 40% of them rely directly on space capabilities in some form or another. And many of the other targets of the Sustainable Development Goals can certainly be supported by space-derived information and services. And yet, as I said, we are seeing a larger and larger number of objects put into space. And so there are currently about 2,800 satellites. Actually, this figure is being updated all the time, depending on when we can expect the next launch of the SpaceX Starlink constellation. The number that will for sure push the number over 2,900. And so the number of space objects is increasing dramatically. But also, as I said, we have a vast number of objects that are larger than about 10 centimeters. And I will describe the sources of these human-made objects shortly. But basically, the distribution of objects in space follows roughly a similar pattern to what you see in the distribution of material on a beach, where you have a few very large boulders, many large rocks, an even larger number of stones, and then a countless number of grains of sand. And we see a similar distribution of material in space. So 34,000 objects bigger than the size of a coffee cup, about 900,000 objects in the range 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters, and millions of objects of a millimeter and above. And these are figures that I got from the European Space Agency's Space Debris Office. So what are the sources of all of these objects in space? Well, of course, we have operational satellites, and those are shown in the red band. This chart shows the increase in the population of artificial space objects from the beginning of the space age up until quite recently. And you can see the number of satellites is shown in the bottom as red. But then above that, you also see other sources of material in space. We have things called payload fragmentation debris. That's basically where satellites or payloads fragment, either because bits break off, or you might possibly have explosions with things that corrode with time and explode. Speaking of explosions, rocket bodies, spent upper stages are also sources of a lot of debris. And you can see here on this chart that the population of objects in space has been steadily increasing, and many of these objects are not performing a useful function. Indeed, only about 5% or fewer of the objects in space at the moment actually perform a useful function for people on the ground. The other 95% of material up there is not performing any useful function and is basically a collision hazard for the other 5% that is doing something useful. So congestion of the orbital environment is one of the issues that has become a concern. The second issue or development is that we are seeing the space environment becoming much more global. This chart shows the number of countries in orange that had satellites in 1966, which for me is a special year because that's the year that I was born. And so when I was born, very few countries in the world were what you could call space powers, and the space environment was fairly pristine, and countries entering the space environment could more or less do what they wanted because the chances of them interfering with anybody else were very, very limited. Now, fast forward 50 years to 2016, and there you can see that the number of countries with space capabilities has increased dramatically. I don't know if you can see on your screens that this slide shows two kinds of space actors: the countries that launch satellites, which are shown in the sort of the stripy orange color, and then the solid orange are the countries that operate satellites, namely countries that have purchased satellites from other countries and had them launched. In any event, you can see that the number of countries that are active in space has increased greatly. We now have more than 90 countries, that's more than half of the UN membership, have either currently have or have had operational satellites in space. So space is becoming a much more global activity than it used to be in the early days of the space age, where there was this kind of exclusive space club that only a few countries belonged to. You can see this, the whole geopolitics of space, how that has evolved. This is a photograph of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which was established in the late 1950s. And you can see here, I think the original number of founding countries was 24, if I remember correctly. And it was basically dominated by discussions between the then two superpowers in space, the United States and the Soviet Union. And most other countries were kind of passengers in those discussions because they didn't have the technical means to be conducting space activities, unlike the two superpowers. However, as over the last 50 years, we've seen a far greater number of countries entering the space domain. And so this is a picture of that same committee that was taken a year or two ago. We currently have 94 member states, and every year the committee receives applications from another 3 or 4 countries wishing to join the committee. It's becoming one of the largest standing committees in the United Nations system, and the number of new countries applying to join every year is evidence of the importance attached to space activities by a growing number of countries. And perhaps during the Q&A, I can come back and tell people a little bit more about how COPUOS works and the way in which we make decisions in COPUOS and how difficult it can be to make decisions when you have to accommodate the views and very different positions of 94 member states, and soon to be over 100, I'm sure. We're also seeing an evolution in the space arena in terms of the typical space actors. This chart shows the distribution of space activities and actors during the space age, beginning in 1957 and going up to 2017. If you look on the left-hand side of the chart, you'll see it's dominated by two colors, basically red and orange, which is the Soviet Union, and then a sort of a dark blue and light blue, which is the United States. And you can see, if you look at the legend on the top of the slide, that the red was Russian military, orange was Russian civilian, the dark blue was US military, the light blue US civilian. And so you can see in the early days of the space age, space activity was dominated by military actors, and the satellites mostly had military functions, predominantly reconnaissance, communications, and later on more and more navigation as well. And then you see, beginning in the late 60s, going into the 70s, other countries entering the space arena. Originally, the Soviet Union and the United States acted as kind of gatekeepers to the space club, and countries wishing to become space capable would normally partner with one of the two superpowers. And in that way, that was how they were able to have their satellites launched into space. And then you see from about the mid-1970s, you start to see that band of other countries growing. That's the yellow band on this chart. And it has become fairly significant with time. Now, you see also from the 70s, you see a green band that emerges, and then it grows until eventually becoming a dominant actor. And that, of course, is this green band here in this chart. These are the private sector actors. And nowadays, the private sector is dominating the space environment, which is a very, very significant shift in how we handle the geopolitics of space. And I'll come back to that later. Okay, let me see if I can. So we're also seeing new kinds of space activities, such as things like on-orbit servicing, which could include things like refueling or life extension or repairs for satellites that are already in orbit. These kinds of activities are being pioneered by both state and non-state actors, and they raise concerns because the capabilities that you need to perform things like on-orbit servicing or active debris removal can also be weaponized and used for counter space activities. And this is a cause for concern for many countries. And it also is something that the existing multilateral fora are finding difficult to deal with, and perhaps we can come back to that in the Q&A. Another issue that is really a major game changer in the space environment is the emergence of the so-called mega constellations, or these are constellations with not tens, but hundreds or thousands of satellites. Perhaps the best known of these currently is the Starlink constellation. As far as I'm aware, they already have over 540 satellites in space, and they were due to have a launch earlier this month, which is now postponed to later in July, and they're launching satellites in batches of about 60 at a time. But they are by no means the only ones. This is a chart that I got from Space News about a year ago, showing the various constellations that are being planned. And of course, even if only 10% of these constellations actually come to fruition, we're still looking at roughly an order of magnitude increase in the number of operational satellites in space. This chart shows a simulation that I took from AGI, just basically showing the number of constellations expected over the next decade or so, and how the space environment is going to be even more congested and contested than it is now. And you can see there, if all the filings come to fruition, you're looking at about 57,000 new satellites that are planned through to 2029. Now, I don't believe that all of those will materialize, but even if only 10% of them do, you can see that's already a huge increase in the number of satellites over what's already there in space. As more countries become more reliant on space for socioeconomic and military reasons, they will feel a need to be able to protect their assets in space against either intentional or unintentional disruptions from other actors. And so more and more countries are pursuing what we call counter-space activities. These are activities aimed at either degrading, destroying, or denying the space capabilities of other states. These capabilities, when they are developed, have to be tested. Sometimes these counter-space capabilities result in destructive anti-satellite tests, essentially where missiles are fired at satellites and produce huge amounts of debris. This is really bad news for everybody because debris does not discriminate between different countries. It just basically spreads out to fill out all the orbital planes after some time and becomes a hazard for all space actors. In addition to these so-called kinetic counter-space capabilities, there are also non-kinetic ones, such as electromagnetic interference or lasers that can be used to dazzle satellites. And then, of course, things like jamming. And then you have also cyber attacks as well. So there's a whole spectrum of counter-space capabilities and threats that are being developed and that are a concern to all space actors. Another area that is of growing concern is space weather. This has to do with the fact that as satellites become smaller and smaller, the electronic components become smaller, you start to have greater susceptibility to space weather-induced failures. And also, as we see more and more non-governmental and non-commercial actors entering the space arena, and I'm thinking of small groups like universities or clubs, groups of people building satellites that don't have the means or the wherewithal to conduct extensive test campaigns and in fact don't intend their satellites to survive for very long. These non-space graded, the use of non-space graded components makes these satellites even more susceptible to space weather disruption, and therefore it's very easy to produce a satellite that becomes dead on arrival in orbit simply due to space weather reasons. And so at Secure World, we focus a bit of our work on space weather as well. Now, there are a number of solutions to these various challenges. And of course, one would begin with finding scientific and technical solutions for the various challenges. And so I illustrate that collectively here in this slide with, this is a demonstration of a net being used to capture a satellite and then to move that satellite into a disposal orbit where it would re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and burn up. The net is just one concept. There have been other concepts involving harpoons, magnets, shape memory alloys, you name it, all sorts of really interesting and exciting ideas. And again, issues or technologies like this raise security concerns as well, because if you can capture a satellite to remove it from orbit, to prevent it from becoming debris, you could also weaponize that technology to take out another country's operational satellite. So apart from technological solutions, there are also solutions in terms of developing norms of responsible behavior. I mentioned that in the early days of the space age, that countries were entering an essentially pristine environment, and they didn't have to worry too much about the possibility of interference with others. And in a sense, that's kind of similar to an analogy with terrestrial road traffic. In the very early days of the use of motor vehicles on roads, there were very few cars, and so the drivers were basically aware of each other and could avoid collisions because, you know, if there were only 2 or 3 cars in a town, it was very easy to see when the others were on the road and to avoid any collisions with them. But as more and more people started to use motorized transport, that kind of situational awareness became harder and harder, and we needed to develop rules of the road. And so this is kind of where we are in space at the moment. We don't really have comprehensive set of rules of the road for the space environment. That's the one point. The other is that we don't yet know, and because we don't have such rules, we don't really know what responsible and irresponsible behavior looks like. Here, this is a series of images that I took from a study that looks at responsible and irresponsible behavior in road use in terrestrial conditions. And I'll just point out, well, I'll make it a challenge for those of you watching the talk to figure out who's the irresponsible actor here. But in any case, rules of the road and rules of responsible behavior make it possible for everybody to know what is the expected behavior and also to recognize irresponsible behavior when they see it. So that's an important area that certainly we at Secure World and many countries are working on. And this pertains to the space environment, where it affects things like close proximity operations, and how close can you approach the satellite of another operator without some kind of coordination. You may have heard in other talks in this conference that there have been activities in geostationary orbit recently where satellites have been moving around the geostationary arc, coming very close to other operational satellites with no coordination among the actors, and that raises huge security and safety concerns. So we also have solutions that come about through policy and regulatory means. I come back to this picture of Corpus. In the space domain, space activities are regulated in or discussed in various fora in the United Nations. The Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, Corpus, discusses what basically its name describes, the peaceful uses of outer space, in other words, non-military uses and international cooperation thereof. We also have a forum in the UN called the Conference on Disarmament that discusses the more military side of things. So these fora discuss many issues of common concern to states. And I give you just one example here. This is a set of guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities that were negotiated in Corpus a few years ago. And it was a huge step forward for the orderly use of space by a very large and increasing number of states. So in the last few minutes of my talk, I want to quickly cover some of the work that we do at Secure World Foundation and give your participants an idea of what we do and the areas that we work in. So our vision is to work towards the secure, sustainable, and peaceful uses of outer space for the benefit of current and future generations. And we achieve this by working in partnership with governments, with industry, with academia, and with civil society organizations from a very wide number of countries all around the world. And I will give you some idea of the countries that we work with. We were founded by Cinda Collins-Arsenault and Marcel Arsenault, our two founders, both of them still very actively involved in our work And I believe Cinda may actually be watching this presentation. If you are, hello, Cinda. But they recognized very early on that the world was becoming increasingly reliant on space, and that it was to ensure the uses of outer space to realize all the enormous benefits that we've become so used to in our generation, and to ensure that those benefits become available to future generations and more countries. We are a private operating foundation based in the United States, but we have an international footprint that covers all of the continents except Antarctica. We have offices in Colorado and in Washington, D.C. Both of those are closed at the moment because of COVID-19, and we're very much looking forward to a return to those as soon as possible, as I'm sure everybody else on this call is as well, looking forward to returning to their normal work situations. This is our team. We get together in our Colorado office once a year to have a strategic planning meeting in August. So a fairly small team, but really very dynamic set of individuals, and really incredibly energetic. And I'm sure a number of them are known to you in SGAC. As I said, we perform several functions. Among them is informing the space community on topical issues. So you see here some of our publications, like our Handbook for New Actors in Space, which provides a general presentation of all of the pertinent issues governing policies and space governance in general. We do a counter space assessment that we publish every year, and we also have a space sustainability handbook. All of these resources are available on our website. We facilitate dialogues. This is an example of our participation in UNIDIR, the UNIDIR Space Security Conference, which we have been co-organizing with UNIDIR for many years now. We stimulate conversation among space actors. This is a picture from our Summit for Space Sustainability that was held in Washington, D.C. last year, that brought together leaders from the space community from around the world. And we're looking forward to our next summit, which will be held this year from September 9th to 11th. It will be a virtual event, and you can see more about that on our website. We promote discussion of ideas that we believe will contribute to the progressive development and codification of space law and the governance of space activities. And I just want to end with a very quick review of some of our current programs. So our program areas fall primarily into three domains: space sustainability, where we're working on supporting the development of international guidelines, standards for proximity operations and responsible behavior, and also things like responsible investments in space. We work in the areas of space safety and security, and you can see there are some of our programs that I've already mentioned earlier on in this presentation. Then we work in the area of space law and space policy, and particularly the rule of law in space. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there is a growing discourse on the use of space resources. We're quite involved in those dialogues together with a number of other organizations, and also developing things like norms of behavior, and indeed the whole dialogue of norms versus legally binding agreements. We also do some work in the area of the application of the laws of armed conflict to space, to the space domain. There are two projects in that regard that we are participating in. We are an observer member of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. We have permanent observer status in the UN, and that allows us to engage in various UN dialogues in the manner that is open to NGOs. And then finally, we have a number of engagements with new space actors and with capacity building, and of course, SGAC falls within this area. And of course, we also have a portfolio that deals with human and environmental security and the application of space benefits to promote human and environmental security. So this is an overview of our activities. showing, this is from our 2018 annual review, that shows the number of activities that we carried out in different parts of the world. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions from the audience. Thanks, Clement.
Thanks a lot, Peter, for this amazing talk. It sure gives lots of insights onto the different issues and challenges that the space sector is facing currently. And we do have quite a few questions from the audience. So let me start with one from Bryce Blackwell, who's asking, how do we establish and enforce international standards for the space traffic use? And like in a concrete manner, I guess. And secondly, how do we determine liability in case of an incident?
Well, both of those excellent questions. So I'll begin with the observation that one often hears the phrase space traffic management. That phrase itself has all sorts of, once you start to unpack what it means, it has all sorts of challenges. It's very difficult to so-called manage traffic in space when only a small fraction of the objects in space is maneuverable and the vast collection is not maneuverable. That's something that we need to bear in mind. I think the question was how to enforce the rules?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's going to come down to an issue of norms of behavior. I don't believe it will be possible to have something like a space traffic police that is going to be, enforcing rules by imposing fines and things like that. I just don't think the world is at that point yet where we can have active traffic enforcement in the way that we have on Earth.
Yeah, I guess this actually brings us to a question that is quite related to what you just said, which is, does peaceful uses of outer space also imply that defense systems ready to be engaged if faced with national threat, or does it categorize more on what specific peace utilities we would be defining to maintain harmony?
Yeah. So peaceful uses of outer space has always been understood to include military actors in space that are using space in a non-aggressive manner. So that's the common understanding of peaceful uses. So for example, as we all know, the navigation constellations were developed and are still operated by military users, but those are certainly considered peaceful uses. Reconnaissance satellites, even if they're military, are peaceful uses because they're not being used actively in military, how shall I say, in aggressive operations directly against other satellites or the ground.
Okay, thanks for this this answer. Okay, I have another question from Bryce Blackwell, saying, how do we currently determine the right of way for satellites when actors have colliding trajectories? What's the current decision-making pattern?
So currently what happens is that operators coordinate with each other. And so if two operators receive information about a possible conjunction and they are concerned that there could be the possibility of a collision, what would normally happen is that the operators would get in touch with each other and reach some agreement about who would maneuver. However, this mode of operation is becoming less and less viable as the space arena becomes more crowded with more satellites and more actors. It becomes very difficult to be able to reach somebody, to contact them, and to resolve a possible conjunction in the traditional way, if you have a few hours or whatever. And so in future, probably what will happen is that we will see the advent of autonomous collision avoidance systems on satellites. And the problem then is that A satellite may have rules that it uses in its own autonomous collision system. But if these satellites don't talk to each other, and if there isn't a common set of rules, so, like in the air or at sea, if two vessels or two aircraft are heading towards each other, there's an understanding of which way both parties have to turn to avoid a collision. We're not yet in that situation with the space environment. And so this is all work that still has to be done.
Okay. And I think I have another question regarding work that still has to be done, which is more about space laws and your vision at the Secure World Foundation. How should space laws be framed for exploiting resources of celestial bodies? What is your vision on that?
How should space laws be framed? Well, that's an interesting question. So there is a lot of discussion at the moment on space resource utilization, and there's a huge debate around that goes around the interpretation of these. I think we're still in the very early days of the debate around space resource utilization. Some work has been done by a group called the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group that was convened by I think it was a Dutch university, University of Leiden, I think acted as the convener for it. And it had a number of non-state actors who were members of that group, including Secure World. This group developed a series of building blocks for what could be the elements of a governance regime for space resource utilization. This is, if you like, a kind of an academic exercise, but conducted by legal experts. And that contains what we believe could be some interesting avenues to pursue for the development of a future legal framework for space resource governance. The outcomes of this work have been presented to Corpus, but by no means accepted. I think the committee still has to study the building blocks. I know that there is an agenda item about this. It will take, I think, still quite a number of years for the committee to get to a point where it reaches a decision about what sort of format should a governance system for the use of space resources take.
Okay, thanks.
So it's Secure World. Sorry, you asked about our vision for Secure World. So what we want to support the development of a governance framework without being prescriptive at this stage about what the form of that framework should be. For us, it's important that all the actors get together, that we discuss the issues, that we understand the issues, and that we support states in developing an international framework that is acceptable to everybody.
Okay, thanks. May I ask you just to stop sharing your screen so that the viewers can see you in a bigger frame? Thanks. And now I have two questions that are actually quite similar, which concern deorbiting of satellites. So Parul is asking, won't deorbiting a satellite and let it burn up while moving in the Earth atmosphere harm the environment? And parallelly to that, from YouTube, we have Nazib Noor saying, besides on-orbit services, which are yet to be achieved by the actors, unannounced and unintentionally re-entry is alarming concern. So is there any non-military body to take this into account?
Okay, so let's begin with the first one about the re-entry of satellites and damage to the Earth's environment. Well, I suppose in principle, if you are burning up a satellite, that whatever its constituent, chemical species are, that's going to be distributed over the atmosphere. I think the effect is probably very small compared to the effect on the atmosphere of a lot of launch activity. If I had to be worried about effects on the environment, probably I would start by addressing the effects of launch activity on the atmosphere. because a lot of those propellants are not what we call green propellants. And so I think that has an impact, particularly in the areas around the launch sites. The second question was, sorry, can you just repeat?
Sorry, yeah, sure. It was about unannounced and unintentional re-entry.
Oh, okay.
And are there non-military bodies that can take that into account?
So yeah, I guess the term we use is an uncontrolled re-entry, where a satellite may not have propulsive capability on board, and so therefore you cannot try and influence the last few hours of the satellite's orbital life to basically force it to re-enter over an ocean. Sure, uncontrolled re-entries are a concern. Luckily, we have never had an incident, to my knowledge, of an aircraft being struck in flight by a re-entering spacecraft. However, given the increase in the number of space objects, I don't think that is a negligible risk for the future. We know that some of these objects survive re-entry. You can very easily go online and find examples of things like upper stage fuel tanks that have survived re-entry surprisingly intact, luckily with no casualties, as far as I'm aware, no human casualties that I'm aware of from re-entering satellites. But still, I think it is a risk for the future. Are there any civilian entities? No, I don't believe there are. I mean, there are groups like there's an interagency group that monitors and studies re-entries of space objects, basically to try and improve our understanding of how objects re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and to use that knowledge to design for demise. But as far as I'm aware, there are no groups that kind of regulate this activity or anything. Basically, a space operator that is expecting a re-entry would normally notify other operator or countries. So the state would notify other states of an expected re-entry and an area of danger that should perhaps be avoided. But that's all it is at the moment.
Okay, thanks a lot. I have a big question that is mostly regarding the biggest challenge you have to face, I think, which is what is the biggest challenge to reaching consensus in the international fora, and how can we prepare ourselves as future policymakers to facilitate dialogue between all the parties?
Well, the biggest challenge to reaching consensus kind of depends on what the issue is. So it's issue specific. So one would have to specify what issue you're talking about. But perhaps let me just give a sense of how these multilateral fora work. So, as I mentioned, in the early days of the space age, where there were a few countries in the so-called Space Club, basically, they had very similar sets of concerns. We now have a much greater number and diversity of space actors. It's not only states, it's non-state actors as well. They all have slightly different concerns or interests, I would say, and they have some overlapping concerns. And so I think for the multilateral fora, especially those like COPUOS and the Conference on Disarmament that work on the basis of consensus, it is trying to find where there are areas of common concerns, shared concerns, that provides the fertile ground for reaching consensus on issues. So one area where one might find common concern is around safety, spaceflight safety. All actors, whether they are commercial or normal civilian actors, government actors or military actors, they all have a concern over the safety of their spaceflight operations. And so that may be one area where, because of this common concern on safety, we can achieve consensus on developing norms of responsible behavior, rules of the road, and so on. But in terms of the different issue areas, of course, depends what it is, if you want to talk about challenges.
Okay. I guess maybe we'll move on to a question from Hunter Erickson about the space community, because the space community has been quite a small group of people for decades, and therefore the relationships became closed unless you haven't been around for years. So what are the steps being taken right now by the Secure World Foundation to allow democratized access for the new startups, agencies, and nations to be part of a space industry going forward without hindrance of all the parties who held all the control before?
Okay, thanks. That's an excellent question. So just before answering that, let me just add another thought onto this, the last question about challenges in reaching international understanding on issues. I think one of the challenges that we're having at the moment is that there are different interpretations of the existing legal framework. And these different interpretations are sometimes very strongly held by the different actors. And so I think one of the challenges is going to be to literally get everybody on the same page in terms of understanding the existing framework and the existing legal principles in the same way. Because as long as there are different interpretations of the already adopted existing legal framework, it makes it difficult for different actors all to negotiate on things if their points of departure are fundamentally different. To return to the last question, this is an area where I think non-governmental entities like Secure World Foundation and others can play a huge role in democratizing the space arena by making it easier for emerging space actors to participate knowledgeably in these discussions in multilateral fora like the UN. This is the reason why we engage with groups like SGAC, because you are the next generation of space leaders. And it's important for us that as you advance in your careers, you become aware of these issues. And sooner or later, many of you will be joining your national delegations to participate in discussions at Corpus. And so therefore, we want to be sure that all of the new emerging actors are empowered to participate in these debates and not just to sit on the sidelines and kind of watch the discussion between the major actors. This is important because as the space environment becomes more congested and contested, what we want to avoid is either the reality or the perception that rules are being made to essentially create barriers to make it harder for new actors to enter the space environment. And indeed, there was exactly such a perception in the early days when we started to negotiate the space sustainability guidelines. A number of states, there were two kinds of views about this. Some states held the view that space sustainability was not their concern, that basically it was the leading spacefaring nations that had put all of this junk up in space. It was their problem and they had to solve it. Of course, that was a misconception based on a lack of awareness of how dependent all countries are on space activities. So space sustainability really is everybody's concern. Another misperception that we had to deal with was that states were suspicious. Suddenly, the countries that had dominated the space arena for the first 50 years, in the absence of rules, suddenly those countries were advocating for the development of rules to keep the space environment safe. And many countries saw this as a way of keeping the space club exclusive and closed to other actors. The important thing to understand is that the space environment today is fundamentally different from what it was 50 years ago. And so that's why it's so important for civil society organizations like Secure World, like SpaceGen, to raise awareness so that the new actors are entering the environment with all the knowledge that they need to be successful and responsible actors.
Okay, thanks a lot for your answer. I guess we're almost out of time, so maybe I'll ask a final short question and then we'll wrap up. So the final question will be, does the Secure World Foundation see the US Space Force as a threat to sustainability?
No, we don't see it as a threat to sustainability. I think that the Space Force idea has been around for a long time. And it has, I think, the discussions have become quite politicized, but military actors have been in space from the very earliest days of the space age. For us, a lot of it has to do with the way that these developments, the messaging around developments, how these developments are presented to the outside world, how they are interpreted by other actors. And so just the existence of a space force or military presence in space does not automatically lead to instability or lack of sustainability in space, in just the same way that the presence of air forces in the skies of the Earth or navies on the Earth's oceans in and of itself causes instability.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Okay, I guess it's time for us to wrap up. So I want to give you a final thank you. Thanks a lot for joining us today for this keynote and this fascinating Q&A session. I hope everyone had a great moment with you and as a representative of the Secure World Foundation. And with that, I'm going to conclude and saying to the delegates here on Zoom, have a nice evening or day wherever you are in the world, and see you tomorrow for the